Well, I am recording on the cloud, meaning on your Zoom account. So you will have the recording, and if you can share it with the rest of us or burn it, whatever seems appropriate. I also am going to share my screen, which is why I'm the host. And if anyone shows up in the waiting room and I have to let them in as the host while I'm sharing screen, I hope I'm able to manage that. We'll see. It's absolutely wonderful that you all worked against the death penalty and that Virginia has finally, at long last, done away with the thing. If we could just get the United States to do away with the death penalty as its chief means of international relations, we would be well on the way. And it's great that you are going to be meeting with Bill and Maria. I may mention them as I'm sharing my PowerPoint, because they are hard at work trying to prevent the expansion of draft registration to include young women as well as young men, this being the big democratic, large D, democratic, progressive feminist right to be forced against your will to kill and die for Lockheed Martin. So I was told I should speak for a while and then do questions and answers. So I'll do that. And when we get to questions and answers, you can explain to me why the draft is an anti-war tool and so forth. I do live up here in Charlottesville. I'm going to be down in Lynchburg this weekend to get vaccinated. Apparently somebody shipped a bunch of vaccines to Lynchburg thinking that people who lived there would want them, which apparently was not the case. So if anybody else hasn't gotten vaccinated, that's the place to go. But I'm not that far from Roanoke and have enjoyed being there with you all in the past, where I'm just one misrepresentative in Congress district over. Let me see if I can share screen. And let me know. Let me know if you're seeing a big green screen now.
Yes.
Okay. So far, I haven't had any problems with people needing to mute or anything. But if something gets very loud where you are, feel free to mute and unmute again. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about the state at the moment of wars and militarism, and then a good bit about things that we can do and be doing. And some of this may be familiar to many of you. Much of it should be pretty new. And I'm going to talk about things we can do, both in terms of activism and in terms of education. And if there are too many words on some of these PowerPoint screens and you actually care what they say, I'll be glad to send you all the link to the PowerPoint and the PDF afterwards. But we have a resource at World Beyond War called the Peace Almanac, which we sell as a book and put online for free and have as a radio, 2-minute blurbs every day that radio stations can take and use. And it's at peacealmanac.org. And today is the anniversary of the first freedom rides, which were long before the famous 1960-61 freedom rides, and which came out of the organizing by the conscientious objectors to World War II in U.S. prisons, who organized to integrate prisons and came out and organized to integrate the outside world. We had today, as some of you may have seen, an announcement from President Joe Biden that, in fact, Donald Trump, in all of his genius, got military spending, which he wildly and dramatically increased, just about exactly right. Almost enough. Needed to be just a little bit more, and he would have had it just right. And so we have this proposal, despite the the ever greater environmental catastrophe that needs addressing, the ever greater risk of nuclear apocalypse, deadly disease pandemics raging. We have this proposal from Joe Biden to go ahead. Oh, I see. I get to let people in the waiting room. There we go. We have this proposal to go ahead and keep spending Trump level spending on the US military, which is just incredible, while proposing big spending on other things, better things than the military, to be paid for with very small taxes on corporations that will pay for the next spending bill over the next 15 years. You know, as if the need to pay for anything else is not going to come up between now and 2036. And the military spending level in the United States, as you may be aware, but most people in the United States are not, is nothing like anywhere else in the world, is darn near the rest of the world's military spending put together. And we have Congress members talking about how they'd like to reduce military spending, sending letters to the president, tweeting nice tweets, but not a single one of them yet, even pretending to make a commitment to vote no on bills that fund military spending at the current level. I say pretending, not to insult them, but because that's their record. Congress members, over the past decades that we've been doing this, we've had times when we had 100 Congress members swearing they would vote against funding the war on Iraq, and then 85 to 90 of them doing so anyway. So there we go. So obviously, what we need is to move the money from militarism to human needs, environmental needs, green energy, infrastructure. There's actually a bill, Senator Markey and Congressman Khanna have a bill called the ICBM Act that would move money from ICBMs, from missiles to vaccines. This is the kind of legislation we need at this point. We also have numerous ongoing wars, including the war on Yemen, which is at the moment and has been for years now the deadliest, with deaths caused by violence and starvation and disease. And we actually have a Congress that voted twice bipartisanly in both houses in the previous Congress under the previous president, when they could count on a veto, to end US participation in the war on Yemen. We have just now Congressman Ro Khanna finally mentioning the possibility of Congress waking up and acting after months to end the war on Yemen, but not having done so. So this is a top demand, and most of these demands that I mentioned, you'll see a link on the screen. You can also go to worldbeyondwar.org or rootsaction.org. These are a couple of places I work to find ways to email Congress members, phone Congress members, sign petitions, learn more, etc. But we have not had this Congress lift a finger yet, not a single one of them, to end a single one of the endless wars that they promised to end, that Biden promised to end, that the Democratic Party platform promised to end, or even in response to missile strikes with press releases accompanying them, which we did have war powers resolutions introduced following similar missile attacks by Trump. Another one of the wars yet to be ended is Afghanistan, another broken promise. One strategy that some of us have been promoting is to get some of the other governments around the world. There are 35 countries now with troops still in Afghanistan, and 6 that have taken them out. And I think the more we can praise those 6 and demand action out of the others, the more we can bring pressure on the U.S. government, which of course has more troops and is the ringleader here, to get its troops out of Afghanistan. There is, of course, the possibility of a congressional strategy of getting the Congress to end the war on Yemen and then move on to ending the war on Afghanistan. But this is, a strategy of months or years at the pace that Congress seems inclined to do things. And then there is the Biden strategy to pressure the White House, which is even less under our influence than the Congress, to finish up its negotiations and get out. Another one of the ongoing wars, very little talked about, even in comparison to the teeny bit to which some of these other wars are talked about, is Syria, where the United States has troops it's backing and arming and supporting that have a chunk of territory, that are controlling oil, that are helping to impoverish Syria, which is suffering under sanctions, as Iran, Cuba, so many other countries. And the United States continues with its goal of overthrowing the government of Syria. The goal of addressing ISIS having been a distraction and never a central goal of the US government, although it certainly was of the US public. And of course, the bombings, have been going on through the Trump years and the Biden years, including before and since that one missile strike that came with a press release. In Virginia, we've got this guy named Tim Kaine as a senator who is constantly talking about war powers and the need for Congress to authorize the wars, and how illegal it is for Donald Trump to send missiles into Syria without Congress. And here's a screenshot of a video on my YouTube page of me asking him at UVA a couple of years back, how in the world could Congress possibly make legal murdering people with missiles in Syria? And him admitting that it couldn't, and then going straight back into his old, rhetoric that he uses to this day of the need for Congress to authorize the wars. So rather than ending all of the wars, what you're getting from the more anti-war so-called Congress members at this point is talk about replacing the AUMFs, the authorizations for the use of military force, with a new one. Not simply repealing them, but creating a new one. And from Senator Kaine, first I want to find out the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots from the White House, which is apparently a god as well as an executor of what the Congress is supposed to control. So this is an ongoing problem. Another area of crisis is, of course, Iran, where we had the promise from the Biden campaign, from the Democratic Party, that the reinstitution of the rejoining of the Iran nuclear agreement that President Obama had put in place, and everyone having known for many months prior to the election and inauguration of Joe Biden that there would be a limited number of months in which to do this, and it would only happen if the United States undid at least some of its sanctions, and that coming in and demanding changes from Iran after Iran complied with the agreement and the United States did not, and the United States left it, was not going to work. And come June, Iran would be sure to elect a government that would want nothing to do with any negotiations with anybody. And that certainly looks like where we're headed if something doesn't change soon. There are talks underway, and we'll see where they go, but we need to keep up the pressure on this. It's very hard to believe that this is not, an intentional so-called failure. The International Criminal Court, we finally last week had President Biden lift the sanctions that Trump had imposed on the top prosecutors and officials at the International Criminal Court. It's hard to imagine anything more lawless, as you're pushing these massive military budgets in the name of the rule of law and the rule-based order of the globe and so forth. Anything more lawless than sanctioning the International Criminal Court. And of course, when they lifted the sanctions, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken put out a statement making very clear that we still oppose the International Criminal Court. We discourage anyone from working with them, but we're for rules and law and cooperation. So we also have a problem in the United States of increased sentiment and rhetoric against countries including Russia and China. Russia being the country that, together with the United States, has about 90% of the nuclear weapons on Earth. And of course, there's some partisan bias. People who identify with the Democratic Party are more likely to blame Russia for everything, and the Republican more likely to blame China for everything. But this works out very well for the US government, which is happy to blame both of them for everything. And so we put out a statement last week or the week before encouraging President Biden not to call the president of Russia a killer or say he has no soul and so forth, even though obviously he's a killer and nobody has a soul, but to not recklessly insult foreign leaders, particularly those of governments with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet many times. And we got no comment back from the White House, but we did see extensive coverage in the Russian media and statement by the Russian foreign minister in response. So we know that they know and care that there are people in the United States who want to negotiate peacefully rather than throw accusations and name calling. Another point of increasing danger is Ukraine, with the United States talking about more ships into the Black Sea and more weapons, and the Ukrainian government talking about war and talking about conquering Crimea and so forth. And you have this problem of people in the United States imagining that Donald Trump was anti-NATO and anti-Ukraine and anti-proper Cold War hostility toward Russia. And therefore, if you're not supportive of belligerence toward Russia, well, you're a racist and you're a Trump fanatic. And it's very strange and nonsensical, but this is, part of what we're up against at this point. So this was the genius of Russiagate, right? You take someone like Trump, who, very similar to his predecessor and his successor, is taking all sorts of steps that are hostile toward Russia, weapons to Ukraine, blocking Russian energy deals, forcing NATO members to buy more weapons, continuing the militarization of the border of Russia, putting missiles on the border of Russia, et cetera, et cetera. And you have actual, honest to God, living human beings in the United States, intelligent, kind, decent people who believe that Trump works for the leader of the government he's so hostile toward. It's very, very strange, but this is part of what we're up against. And so we now have a new brand, a new party, a new president. War is now not going to be racist and fascist. It's going to be humanitarian and anti-terrorism and anti-Trump. But there's not much difference if you're living in one of the wars. So this is a little cartoon of Senator Sinema from Arizona, who did a little happy dance when she voted no on the minimum wage. I think there is just massively more evidence that the United States Senate hates you and wishes you ill than there is that any foreign president or prime minister does. And I think there have got to be some people in Washington who are delighted whenever anger is directed across the borders to elsewhere. And of course, the scientists who maintain the doomsday clock tell us we are closer than ever before to nuclear apocalypse. The risk is greater, and yet the steps being taken are exactly the reverse. More nuclear weapons, more nuclear policies, more openness to using nuclear weapons, and the movement around the world. The many nations that have put in place a treaty to prohibit even the possession of nuclear weapons is up against this escalation of nuclearism, led principally by the US government, and to be found in the budget proposal from President Biden today. And this is in line with the behavior of the US government, which is, party to fewer basic human rights treaties in the world than almost any other country. And just this week, the Pentagon declared landmines to be a vital tool that they could not responsibly forego using. So there's this notion now, as we're some months into the Biden presidency, that, well, we're getting a few things, we're not getting some other things, but that's the way it goes. We didn't elect a different president. We elected this one, and he's giving us what he promised. And yet, if he was actually giving us what he promised, or trying to give us what he promised, or making a real effort to get us half of what he promised, we would be significantly better off. The promises are never as bad as the performance. And these are some of the promises not from the Democratic Party, not from Bernie Sanders, from Joe Biden, candidate for president. So World Beyond War is the organization that I work with on anti-war issues the most. And there are a lot of ways that other organizations can work together with World Beyond War. You can sign the peace pledge that we have on our website at worldbeyondwar.org/organization. You can consider becoming an affiliate organization, which gets lots of support and resources from us, and we work together on things. You can consider joining some of the campaigns where we've got going around divestment, something we did here in Charlottesville, got the city to take public dollars out of weapons. Police demilitarization, something else we did here in Charlottesville, among elsewhere. Billboard campaigns, blocking weapons shipments with our bodies, something that World Beyond War chapters are doing, or start something new and get us to join in. Here's a picture of some World Beyond War folks blocking trucks taking tanks to ship off to Saudi Arabia for the war on Yemen. This picture is from Canada. This is advice for activism in general, which some of you may not need. You may have been doing activism longer than I have, but it's useful to keep in mind that everything can be educational when we do these divestment campaigns and demilitarizing police campaigns, the draft resolutions, all the whereas clauses, the op-eds, the interviews, the flyers. Everything serves to educate people and to organize people for the next action down the road. You may have noticed my my impression that the U.S. Congress is not exactly jumping to the call of public opinion, but local governments are a lot easier, and globally, and governments in other countries are a lot easier. And so it's useful to work locally and globally, not just nationally. You'll go nuts if you just work nationally in the most war-prone nation. Make your own media, record everything as we're recording this. Do nothing that does not take seriously how urgent the crises are, and do nothing that isn't fun. When we did divestment in Charlottesville, we did divestment from fossil fuels and weapons, not just weapons, because divesting from fossil fuels is respectable. Divesting from weapons is treasonous. So we combined the two, and we're working on campaigns to get militaries included in climate agreements. You know, there's an escape clause for, you know, for, you know, climate reduction in carbon emissions. You know, they exclude militaries, even though they are among the biggest sources. So there are issues like this where you can bring environmental groups, at least the local ones, together with peace groups, and have a bigger movement together. The single biggest enemy over at the Pentagon is not in reality Iran or North Korea or Russia or China. It is treating college as public education, as other wealthy countries do, giving people a choice, because people join the U.S. military for all variety of numerous complex reasons, but the most common reason among the most volunteers in the U.S. Army is the lack of another choice, the lack of education or career options. And we have to, people say, you criticize a war, you must hate the troops. Can't you love the troops? Well, I love the troops enough to give them free college as a choice. Can you love them that much with me? Is my response. So I mentioned divestment is one campaign that we are working on in cities and universities and states and nations around the world. It's our money, it's public money. We were never asked. A teacher who's worked for decades teaching children good things should not have his or her retirement dependent on there being more wars. It's just revolting. And we ought to be able to get the money out, and we are. And it's something you can do. If you go to this last link on this slide, divestcville.org, you'll see the resolution we used in Charlottesville. You can watch the videos of us talking to the city council, etc. We've just started an effort in Richmond to get the city of Richmond to divest from weapons. It's easy. You get a success, you get people involved, and you mobilize them for the next thing. Same with demilitarizing the police. And this is something where there is some slight chance that something might happen at the national level. There was supposed to be an executive order from President Biden in his early weeks, and he announced it one morning, and it has yet to show up. There are Congress members demanding it. There is a bill in Congress to kind of partially end the giving of war weapons by the federal government to police that may make it into the military bill. There's another that would end that program entirely. But we want local police to not get weapons of war from anywhere, not just from the US government, and to not do military style training, whoever provides it, US government, the Israeli government, private companies. And you can pass this sort of resolution locally fairly easily. Again, I mentioned at the beginning, when Republicans were controlling Washington, D.C. In their sexist way, where women are just not up to the task of killing anybody, we didn't have to worry about the draft registration being expanded to women. Now, with courts having ruled that it's unconstitutional to impose it only on men, we have a big push by the Democrats in Congress, possibly to slip it in almost unnoticed in this coming military bill to double the number of people who have to register for the draft. Which is actually not a tool of peace, but a tool for giving the war makers many more bodies to throw into wars. So beyond activism, education, and the two are interlocked and you can do them together, but World Beyond War is doing all kinds of educational activities, and most of them now for the past several months have been online, but we're doing book clubs with authors, webinars, lengthy online courses, etc. And we're eager to work with others on all of these. Um, I think just to throw a couple of key points related to anti-war education in here, I think in the United States, I find, especially with young people who haven't really formed opinions on war or peace and don't know that much about it coming out of U.S. schools, that you have to point out the unique role of the United States, and it has a big impact when you do. The United States is not one country among others. It is the war machine. It is the top wager of war, spender on war, seller of weapons, giver of weapons, provider of training and maintenance of weapons, instigator of coups. Almost all the foreign military bases are U.S. foreign military bases. And so it's worth understanding that the places we think of as war-prone countries actually manufacture almost no weapons. And it's a very small number of northern wealthy countries led by this one that manufacture the weapons and export them to the places where they are primarily used. Because when you talk about education and opposing war and opposing all war, especially in the United States, almost nobody wants to talk about anything other than World War II. Last year, I think it was last year, I wrote a book called Leaving World War II Behind, and I just present the table of contents here. I think there are a number of arguments why World War II was not a good, just, noble, justifiable war. But even if there weren't, it's just bizarre to go 75 years back in the past to find a justification for what we just saw yet again today, what is the majority of discretionary spending from the US government. This one little item, war, is bigger than everything else put together. And yet you have to go back 75 years to a completely different world to find an example of it that people want to claim was justified. If people would drop that and recognize how far in the past that was and how little it has to do with today, then I wouldn't care if they just adored World War II. There are lots of ways to work globally, and World Beyond War can help with getting allies and connecting groups across borders, because we increasingly have chapters and people around the world. One of the most powerful tools for any local peace group is the website. You'll get back, thousandfold what you put in to having the best possible website. And I think this is the last slide I've got here. This is what World Beyond War started with 7 years ago, and we now have people having signed it in, what are we at? 190 countries. And it's just these 2 sentences, and you can sign it at that link, worldbeyondwar.org/individual. And when you do, there are a bunch of check boxes that you can check if you want to indicate what you want to be involved in and what you don't want to be involved in going forward, working toward peace and the abolition of war. So with that, let me stop sharing screen, and everybody feel free to unmute if you want to ask a question. Or Gary, did you want to say anything at this point?
No, well, just for latecomers, I put Plowshare Peace Center's address in the chat. We can continue to depend on your contributions and pledges to keep going. I think I'll reclaim host too, if that's okay, David.
Sure, I'll make you host. And I see Michael has his hand raised.
I think I just click here. If there are any latecomers, I can keep an eye on them then. Okay, I'm host now.
Am I on then?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
David, I want to thank you for a couple of things. First of all, I got as a Christmas present this year your World War II book and read it, and I thought I had knew something about World War II, but I learned so much in that book, and I highly recommend it to anyone else that hasn't read it yet. That was a brilliant piece of work, and it was highly referenced in the back. So I commend you for all of that effort for putting that together. Also, I subscribe to your emails. I've made contributions. And the one that came today, which you shared some of that information on the Biden budget, that was a stunner to realize that we have not improved anything at all with Biden in foreign policy. I really had hoped for more, but Blinken is an old holdover from the Obama years, and it's just going to be a continuation of Russiagate, and it's just so disappointing. But I thank you for your emails. I learn a lot from them. I value them, and if any of you haven't subscribed, please do that as well.
Oh, well, thank you for all of those wonderful comments and for your support and contributions. And I agree 100%. I mean, it's always dangerous to say haven't improved anything at all, because there's always, 18 tiny little things that somebody will point to, and no two politicians are actually strictly identical. But my God, you're spending this massive mountain of money on all of these wars, and Biden comes somewhere within the range of the increase by inflation of the exact amount that Trump, somehow Trump got it exactly right. And all of the war, none of the wars have been ended. None of the weapon sales have been ended. A couple have been stalled. It's just, I mean, you can't say the two presidents are exactly alike, because you do have changes on domestic issues. You have radical changes in rhetoric and presentation. But on foreign policy, there's such bipartisan harmony, and it's so out of touch with the public, even with the public that identifies with one of those two parties. If we could just have public referenda on key issues, if we could just have, Congress members picked with darts at a phone book, we would be just so much better off.
Good, Jim.
Thank you. I learned about David through your book, David, Curing American Exceptionalism. And I bought a dozen copies, and I've shared them. And after reading that, I knew that we wanted you to participate in our Plowshare programming, and I hope we can do it again. But rather than just my buying books and giving them to people, have you generated a synoptic DVD or something that I could show? I participate with the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights, which brings up the terrible inconsistency of the Leahy rule, the Leahy law, which Betty McCollum has championed, that our foreign aid to Israel, for example, is without any accountability, and that we're getting took every year millions of dollars from Virginia, and a very tiny number of Virginians have any clue about where that money goes and how it's spent. And so basically the folks that I speak with in Floyd County, one stoplight, rural Virginia, still think America is the paragon of every moral and religious value, and the bubble that we live in is just, it's a vacuum. And I would just love to show the video at our library. I showed 18 documentaries in 2018 from Voices from the Holy Land, which is generated by JVP and many other sources, which we have resource for in Virginia. And so I would just like to be able to share another subject that gets at the idea that we aren't who we think we are, and we're doing ourselves in, we're poisoning ourselves, and we're living a huge lie.
Well, thank you. Thank you for buying the books. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for, I agree again, 1000% with everything that's just been said. I actually found it oddly, sadly, encouraging that within the past day or two, President Biden called mass shootings in the United States an international embarrassment, strictly because the United States for decades has been full of so many international embarrassments. And I can't recall a US politician, much less president, ever mentioning one before. I think, you know, I've lived in other countries and people are always asking me, what do Americans think of my country? What do people around the world think of our country? Every country on earth, I think, is obsessed with what does the rest of the world think of our country. The United States, as far as I can tell, has never given a flying fart what anybody outside of it thinks of anything. And so to have, I mean, it's tragic, it's horrific, it's much worse than an embarrassment, but to have a president say that something is an international embarrassment, as if it actually matters what people outside of the United States think of something, I find that encouraging. I can't imagine, you know, Trump having said that, or any previous president, you know, in my lifetime at least. I also, you know, on the same topic of mass shootings, I've been publishing every time there's a mass shooting, an updated study of just how disproportionately the mass shooters are US veterans, have been trained in shooting by the US military. And it's absolutely strictly whited out from the US media. There's not a single US media outlet that will touch that story. And you know, the only excuse I've ever been given is we don't want to create a prejudice against veterans. Well, who the hell does want to create a prejudice against veterans? But there's every story mentions that they're almost all male. There's endless stories about how they're disproportionately have had, you know, mental health issues. Endless stories about how they've disproportionately have, you know, been abusive and misogynistic and sexual assault record and so forth. Well, nobody's worried at all about prejudice against men or prejudice against mental health victims or prejudice against, you know, people who own guns. I mean, so it's an excuse. Nobody wants to mention that, you know, a mass shooter is far more than twice as likely to be, to have been trained in shooting at public expense by the US military. So to answer your question, do I have a DVD about curing exceptionalism or something else? Well, I do have YouTubes of things like this event, but on that topic, on my YouTube page and on, I think, the page davidswanson.org/curing exceptionalism. But also, if you go to World Beyond War and click on resources, or worldbeyondwar.org/resources, there's all kinds of films and videos and PowerPoints and materials for events, endless films and videos. I just watched a new film today, if you can call it that. It's only 12 minutes, called something like voicemails from the fly zone or something. You'll find a review on at the very top of davidswanson.org and worldbeyondwar.org. But in Vermont, a year and a half ago, they started landing and taking off these F-35s from this airport in Burlington in the middle of, houses and schools and shopping centers. And it's so loud that people can't think. Their insides are vibrating. It causes cognitive damage in children. And so these filmmakers, because of the pandemic, they set up this voicemail, and they just had people come in and rant about the F-35s flying over, and we're moving out of Burlington. And I'm reminded of this because one of the comments was to the effect of hoping Senator Leahy would rot in hell. Those are the exact words, because he was one of the chief politicians involved in putting the F-35s into Burlington. But I agree that the Leahy law, if anybody ever enforced it, would be a good idea. I think the bill that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar had last Congress, and supposedly is going to have this Congress, called the Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act, is a good idea. You don't give deadly war weapons or sell them to the countries that are worst on human rights. Now, it's very weird and twisted because human rights to Western politicians means domestic policy, right? You could be the biggest war maker in the world, but if you have decent domestic policies and you're not locking people up without charge and torturing them and so forth, then you're outstanding at human rights. Or you could be the most peaceful nation on earth, but be the most horrific at human rights. So I don't know how you give anybody war weapons without abusing human rights. I think bombing me kind of violates my human rights. But to as far as it goes, stop arming human rights abusers is an idea. I wrote a book a couple years back called 20 Dictators Currently Supported by the US Government. And what I looked at the 50 governments that the US government considers the most oppressive. This is bad human rights policies domestically, and found that the US government arms, trains, and or funds 48 of their militaries, 48 out of 50, 96% of the most oppressive governments on earth. And so I picked out 20 of them that were, that were dictators in the most common sense, a single guy, running the show, and wrote about them. Sorry, I'm going on and on and on, but I also wanted to mention the Kings Bay plowshares, because I keep hearing the word plowshares. And today, the last participant in this Kings Bay plowshares action was sentenced and is going to be doing some more time behind bars. But there are people out there who are taking these risks in the name of protecting the world from nuclear weapons and other weapons, and we have to try to support them. Whistleblowers as well. Daniel Hale, drone whistleblower, pleading this past week, and now facing 10 years when sentencing happens.
That's a bunch of leads. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sherman, did you have a question?
Question. David, you talked some about Russia. You also talked about the portion of money that the U.S. spends on the military compared to the rest of the world. I was wondering about, I was thinking about the kind of the unraveling of the Soviet Union and under Gorbachev in that era. And I think a lot of that is what we're seeing today is a lot of the after effects of that. But I was wondering, how long can the United States continue to spend the amount of money we spend on the military before our economy unravels or other consequences we see in society occur?
It's a good question. I do think part of the undoing of the Soviet Union was its over expenditure on militarism and its under expenditure on a lot of other things. But I think a lot of it also was steps toward peace and understanding and disarmament taken by the US and Soviet governments. And another big chunk of it was nonviolent activism in Eastern Europe that overthrew governments and split the Soviet Union to pieces. So there were a number of factors. And I highly recommend looking at this organization that Sharon Tennyson runs that's called something like Center for Citizen Initiatives that does trips to Russia. I went on one a few years ago. I'm hoping to go on one this year. But it's just eye-opening to go and meet with Russian students and scholars and scientists and politicians and artists and talk about these issues with them, because they, of course, have a very different perspective than we do, including on Gorbachev. And we met with Gorbachev as well and got his perspective on himself. I don't claim any expertise at economics. The stuff, bewilders me. I feel confident in saying that I want money moved from horrible things to good things, and in pointing out that there is clearly more than enough money for everything I can dream of and more. Because I see how much money the corporations have, how much money the billionaires and multimillionaires have, and how much money the weapons dealers are getting. But how many more years this can go on? I suspect it can go on longer than the climate and the ecosystems can bear the way they're being treated, and quite likely longer than we can continue without nuclear apocalypse. So, pick your poison. I'm not sure that imperial economic collapse is the first horror that's going to hit us. But again, I claim no particular expertise on the question. Yes, go ahead.
I think that we should bear in mind one thing, that the Soviet Union basically broke up without a bloodbath. And those so-called evil Reds, evil commies, did not instigate a bloodbath in the Russian republics in Eastern Europe during the breakup. Now, contrast this with what the United States has done. Vietnam, I won't even go to the other examples. There's too many to mention. By the way, Bill Bloom had that in Rogue State, all these examples. We couldn't even let a small peasant nation like Vietnam leave on its own, make up its own mind about its future without a horrible bloodbath. So I just think that's something that the Soviets should be commended for. There weren't bodies everywhere. They weren't bombing parts of their former nation, the nations around them. And it's a big contrast to the way that the United States does business. And I think John Ketwood could say something to that.
Well, I understand, I've read, I can't tell you exactly where I read it, that the real reason that we went to war with Iraq was that Saddam Hussein made a decision to base his money on the euro instead of the American dollar. And we couldn't have that. And we've been blowing them up for, 8 years or so now? So, there's a lot to what you're saying, George. I think we could find a lot more examples if we look around the globe.
Thank you, John.
Well, I agree with both of you. I think it's more like 20 years off and on that the U.S. has been bombing Iraq. If you go to davidswanson.org and you click at the top where it says war lists, you'll find the lists that Bill Bloom put together and numerous other authors put together of all the wars, all the attempted overthrows, all the successful coups, all the bombings, and it's just endless. There's a professor at American University in Washington named David Vine, who came out with a book this past year called The United States of War, where he completely debunks this notion that the United States has been at war 89% or whatever. The United States has always been at war. Every single moment that there has been a United States and before, it has been at war. And it is just endless. And, you know, I mean, if the Russian government were the only government on earth, I would have nothing but criticism for it. I mean, everybody's got a horrible government, including the Russians. But if you're comparing, who's violating international law, who's promoting militarism, who's pushing weapons on dictatorships more than the other guy, I mean, there's no comparison. I mean, Russia, people who get mad at US imperialism are always crowing about how Russia is standing up against US imperialism and is going to be, a force against the unipolar world. And so, yes and no. I mean, Russia wanted to join Europe, wanted to join NATO. Russia was too valuable as an enemy. They wanted to keep Russia as an enemy. Russia has proposed, a treaty to ban cyber attacks. Russia is more valuable as somebody to blame for cyber attacks. Russia has wanted to ban weapons in space. It's much more valuable to have Russia as a supposed competitor for developing more weapons for space. How many of you have seen the monument to the 9/11 victims that Russia gave the United States?
No.
See, after 9/11, the government of Russia gave this huge monument to the United States of America in memory of the victims of the 9/11 attacks in New York City. And it was kept out of the news. It was stuck over on the shore of New Jersey, beyond the Statue of Liberty and over near Staten Island. And I think Putin was there. I mean, the top Russians were there for a ceremony, but it was tucked away in this little corner and hidden, and no TV coverage. So people think it's fake news if you talk about it, right? But it's there. It's a giant teardrop. It's like this giant marble vertical rectangle with this silver teardrop hanging down in the middle of it. I mean, Russia has tried. Russia is not perfect, but they're reducing their military budget. They're the big, evil, horrible threat on the basis of which the US has to increase its military budget for whatever Biden's reasons are, as well as for whatever Trump's reasons were. Yet Russia spends about 8% on its military of just the Pentagon budget. The Pentagon budget sort of stands in the US media for the whole US military budget, which, with the nukes in the Energy Department and all the other agencies, it's actually about $1.25 trillion a year. Just take the 750 billion or so that we talk about. Russia spends about 8% of that on its military. If you look at it per capita, the US government takes well over $2,000 from every man, woman, and child every year for the military, where Russia takes $100-some from every man, woman, and child in Russia. So it just doesn't compare. And the notion that there's a that there's a credible threat out there, that there's a reason for a defense department that would defend from something, it's just not credible. There was a poll many years back where they were Gallup polling, US polling company, respectable corporate organization, polled people in about 65 countries and asked, what is the biggest threat to peace in the world? And the winner in most countries was the US government. But in the United States, the winner was Iran. Iran spends, I think, 1.3%.
David,
Yeah,
are we locked up?
is who locked up?
Uh-oh.
I'm sorry, what's the question?
Well, first I wanted to make a comment that in 2019, the interest on our national debt, $67 billion, was more than Russia's total military expenditures for the year. If I may, and I'll be quick, but I'd like to read you the letter I emailed to Kane and Warner today. The topic that they asked for is defund the Pentagon. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I'm very much opposed to President Biden's suggestion that our defense budget be increased. I find our militarism is offensive in every sense of the word. The Pentagon is corrupt, as documented in a Forbes magazine article December 8th, 2017, and an article in The Nation on January 7th, 2019. The ill-fated attempt at a first ever audit of the Department of Defense had found the DoD's records in quotes, riddled with so many bookkeeping deficiencies, irregularities, and errors that a reliable audit was simply impossible. End of quote. Investigators were met with another quote, stonewalling and concealment. One of the most common techniques was unsupported adjustments. One investigator found that those unexplainable adjustments between 1998 and 2015 by the Army alone totaled $21 trillion more than our national debt at that time. In 2015, the Army was allocated $122 billion annual budget, but the Treasury Department made a cash deposit of $794.8 billion to the Army's account, and the Army's records showed accounts payable of $929.3 billion. Senator, our military's not won a significant conflict since World War II, almost 70 years ago, but our defense expenditures are more than the next 11 countries combined. We need to cut the defense budget to half, pay down the national debt, and fund education, universal health care, infrastructure, and remedies for climate change. Today, the Pentagon employs more than 600,000 defense contractor companies, and the most prized status symbol in America is not a Rolex watch or a Rolls Royce in the driveway. It's a defense contract, a license to coin money. Our country can no longer afford to maintain 800 overseas bases. I hope you'll work to defund the Pentagon.
Good.
Thank you.
It'll be ignored, but I had to say it.
Well, the more of them they get and the more phone calls they get and the more they get it publicly in the media, it gets a little bit harder to ignore. So I do wish you wouldn't use that word though, defense, unless you honestly believe there's something defensive about it. I just call it the military contracts, military contractors, the U.S. military, because if it actually were defensive, if that was actually what it was in the ordinary meaning of the word, I'd be in favor of it, of course. And so,
David, what are you working on now? Are you working on any new books?
I'm not. I seem to eat up all of my time working for World Beyond War and rootsaction.org and Talk World radio show and events like this one and writing articles and helping other campaigns. Today, a new campaign was launched to try to start a movement at the UN for a treaty to ban armed drones on the model of banning landmines and cluster bombs and nuclear weapons. And so there's a website called bankillerdrones.org. there's just endless things like this coming up, and we're doing these online courses and book clubs, and so forth. I would quit some jobs and just write books if I had the money, but emails pay more than books, sadly. So someday I'll write another book, but apart from you wonderful people, I think most people have yet to read most of my existing books, so I can share those around.
David, are you taking time to ride your bicycle much anymore?
A little bit, yeah. Why do you ask?
Good. Well, I remember I was looking at the cover of your Ending World War II, and I noticed that you had finished a bicycle ride before that scene where you were at the Iwo Jima Monument.
Yeah. You weren't on that ride, were you?
No, but I ride my bike a lot, and I have stand-up bikes and tricycles and the like.
Nice. No,
So
there was a guy from Raleigh, North Carolina, a World War II veteran, who had decided to oppose wars, and he organized this annual bike ride up to Washington, and I sometimes I usually helped with the website and promotion and stuff, but then I sometimes managed to do the last 20 miles or something up there in Northern Virginia, from Reston, where I grew up, down to DC. And so my son, who's on the cover there, the smaller guy on the cover there, is my older son, he's 15. I think he was maybe, I don't know. This was several years ago. Anyway, he and I did that trip, but it was, a big group of people on bikes with flags and so forth. And we get down to the Iwo Jima Memorial, and we're outnumbered by the people with the red, white, and blue uniforms and stripes and war paraphernalia. And so, but we didn't bother them, they didn't bother us. It wasn't there was no protest rally or hostility. It was just, we're here to oppose what you all are celebrating. And
it was a good photo. It was a
The
good.
fellow from North Carolina has had to stop doing that. He was in his 90s, I believe. He's a considerably older man and would ride every year from North Carolina to Washington, D.C. But I think he's kind of given up on it now.
Yeah, he stopped. He got a young guy there in Raleigh to make a nice film about it. I can send you all the link if you can't find it yourselves. What was his name? Sam, Winstead,
but I don't remember his last name.
Sam Winstead or something like that. But he got this young guy to make a pretty lengthy, documentary film about his bike rides. And we had some pretty good rallies. One that year it was at Iwo Jima. Another time it was at the White House. But we sort of like ended the bike ride and had a rally with speakers, and it's a good effort. People should start more things like that.
Guys, this has been wonderful, and I'm going to have to part right here in just a minute. I hate to leave you all, but
it has been great, and I'm looking forward to seeing the PowerPoint, because you went too fast through them, and I wanted to read more of the details. But that's fine if we get an opportunity to get that PowerPoint and look at it more slowly. There were a lot of excellent things on there I want to remember. So thank you again.
Will do.
Are there any more questions or comments?
David, I was the person who presented the Leaving World War II Behind to Michael as a Christmas present. It was from that.
Thank you.
I think the 20 I ordered from you, copies, 10 or 20 books. So
Wonderful.
I've him as much as I can. Thank you a lot, and I do appreciate your effort in that regard.
David, I did have one question. I was doing some reading in preparation for the event tonight, and in your Civil War book, I thought it was very provocative. You were talking about breaking up the United States into more manageable nations, I think. This is from,
Well, yeah, I don't actually own or control Wikipedia, and I would be grateful till the day I die if any one of you would go to the Wikipedia page about me and make it resemble me a little bit more. Because the fact that I made some comment, like a single sentence years and years ago about the pros and cons of secession and splitting up the United States, that according to Wikipedia is, the bulk of what I work on, is just very weird. So if one of you were to go to davidswanson.org/about and look at my resume according to me, and if you think I've inflated it somehow, fix it, but make Wikipedia David Swanson just resemble it a little bit, mention a couple things I actually work on, that would be great. I'm actually unfamiliar with my Civil War book. You would have to inform me of what that is. Do I have a Civil War book?
The Wikipedia thing was a little strange. It was half about secession, breaking up the United States into more manageable nations, and then about
Right,
half
if you
of it
wouldn't
was
mind deleting that or adding 8 other things so it doesn't dominate, I would be just immensely grateful. You can't edit your own Wikipedia, that's the thing. So I just
yeah, I've
ask
never done
everybody,
that,
and
but I
nobody
can-
does it. Could you go make it be a little bit about me and not about this, dedicated professional secessionist or whatever?
Well, was that an accurate quote though? I mean, I find it very provocative because it's like a sacred thing, the Union and all that. I mean,
Oh, should the North have let the South secede? I don't think.
no, in the piece excerpts, it talks about how, if the United States wasn't so big a country, if it was more, smaller nation states, people would be able to, like Wisconsin would be able to deal with its affairs more easily in California and that so on. This
Well,
is an old.
I don't
it's like
think
from
that's
10 years old.
controversial. I mean, democracy is harder the bigger it is. I don't think that's controversial. I think if the United States were smaller, if it were 3 or 4 or 5 countries, I think each of those countries would have a better shot at representative government. Of course, infinite details, and because some of them could go horribly wrong. But I think yeah, one of the problems with efforts at self-government in the United States is it's too damn big. I mean, the House of Misrepresentatives is a House of Misrepresentatives because it's literally not possible for somebody to represent 750,000 people. How do you represent 750,000 people? You can't.
I was just a bit taken aback when I read it, but I thought, well, that's an interesting thought, and I never thought about it that way.
But see, over decades, you have a million thoughts, and you make 10 million comments about them, including things you didn't think about that you make comments on. And they pick one and make it dominate your Wikipedia page. So again, if anyone's inclined to fix that, I'd be.
I've never done Wikipedia before. Maybe I can delete it.
That would be great, or replace it or add something to it. I mean, obviously I don't think maybe it mentions one of my books. I have lots of books. Maybe it mentions one of my jobs. I have lots of jobs. I mean, we should all fix up each other's Wikipedia pages and create them if somebody doesn't have them, because.
Yeah, the first half of the piece is more representative, I think. Well, thanks for coming and speaking to us, David. It was a very rich discussion. And if there are no more comments or questions or thoughts, well, I guess we'll adjourn. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, David.
Thank you
Very much.
very much.
Jim is trying to say
I'm
something.
dying to say something.
Your
Did you know
honorarium,
that?
I deposited your honorarium this afternoon, so
Oh, that's not it. That's not it.
website.
To David, David, did you know that we've documented Israeli training of Virginia police departments in 5 different municipalities so far? And I want to clone this letter to the, it's 100%. I think Durham, North Carolina was the first one to ban Israeli training.
Yep.
And so the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights, this is one of our big campaigns in Virginia. And we have a sister organization in Texas. You know, Alex McDonald, do you know that? Anyhow,
Yeah.
so this is we're very engaged in this and bringing, we took it to the General Assembly in January and explained what was happening. And they didn't know hardly nobody knew about it. And they said, absolutely not. This is not what we're about. So I'd like to know a lot more about how that happened in Charlottesville. And I think you said there was something online, the statement that was read. But I would like to publicize that quite a bit.
Yeah, well, this was the motivation that got us started in Charlottesville. Was a friend of mine who's Jewish, who's very concerned about Israel and Israeli wrongdoing and U.S. wrongdoing, who didn't want, you know, Israeli military training U.S. local police departments. And so even though our resolution never mentioned Israel,
Right.
we made sure that we got it passed, including a ban on the Charlottesville police being trained in military style training by anybody, including the U.S. government, foreign governments, or private companies, because that includes the Israeli government. And yeah, if you go to worldbeyondwar.org and go to under campaigns to demilitarize policing, or you go to worldbeyondwar.org/policing, or you email me, I can give you information on what we've done and what people are doing in other cities.
That was the language we used when we went to the General Assembly. We did 38 Zoom meetings with both delegates and senators, and
Wow.
for information. But anyhow, you're my hero, and I'm just
Well, if
thrilled
something
to death.
if you could get something passed at the state level, that would save a lot of work at the cities.
Well, that's why we're headed for and we've been to Washington too. So yes, we want it to be a statewide awareness. And that's why I need to be on board with that. My son is a police officer, and it grieves me greatly that he doesn't realize what's going on. I think you mentioned indirectly 1033, and there's been mention of that in the news recently as well. I'm sure you know more about it than I do, but anyhow, I just want to say thank you so much.
There's one bill to mostly end it, and there's another bill to end it entirely, and one or both of them might make it into the big military bill that will pass.
Brokana's bill.
Well, Hank Johnson has the bill that he's had year after year after year to more or less get rid of most of it. And then Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez has a bill to abolish the 1033 program.
Yeah.
And for latecomers, again, our next Plowshare program is May 7th at 7 p.m. through Zoom. There'll be a program on conscientious objection. It's for adults and for teens. Bill Galvin and Maria Santelli from the Center on Conscience of War will be leading the program May 7th at 7 p.m. through Zoom. So we'll have the Zoom invitation out. All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you all.
Bye.